Good morning, ladies. World History class. This is Thursday, April 9th. Now, what I have provided for you, what I've uploaded for you in the materials, is the outline form for Chapter 21, Discontent and Experimentation. I just want to explain briefly that, excuse me, I'm going to make the outline available and we will fill it in together here. I'm not giving it as an assignment, but you need to fill it in nonetheless and either attach a file back to me or take a picture of it and send it back to me so that I can tell that you've completed filling out the outline and then get it back to me. And I denote that in the grade book. I don't give it as an assignment. It doesn't get a grade straight up, at least initially, on the assignment page there in your classroom. But I do mark it in my book, and I will work out the details of points at the end of the quarter. So that's how it'll work. Now, what I'm going to do today is an abbreviated version of what we normally do with this chapter, but we're going to go through and I will type in the terms that go into each of the blanks, and we'll do a short explanation of those things as we go. And so you should have your outline there, and section 1, weaknesses in the democracies. We'll explain what that means and fill in as we go. So you should have your outline in front of you. You can fill that in again. Get that back to me so that I can verify that you've completed it. This will be due by April 15th, which is next Wednesday. If you, we'll say Wednesday by 4 o'clock. I don't know if I might have put the time on the material there, but let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 21 deals with the time frame between the world wars, and during this time, there's in a sense, a stagnation of leadership, if you will, in the Western democracies. And you see the rise of totalitarian governments in Italy, in Germany, and eventually, as we know, World War II will spring forth from this context. But what was going on during the 1920s and 30s that kind of helped to create this situation that resulted in the Second World War? So the context of our discussion here in Chapter 21 is dealing with those general issues. Now, from the chapter, I gave you an assignment from one of the reading sections, and it dealt more or less with what we're talking about in our section 2 here on our outline. But what were some of the issues? So first of all, you have weaknesses in the democracies, and the first word that you would use to fill in there is fragmentation. You have the fragmentation of the British Empire. Great Britain was losing hold of the territories that it held as a part of its empire. As you know, the British Empire grew significantly, especially in the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars. They had been colonizing really from the 17th century forward, but really ramped it up into the 19th century, and they held control of large tracts of China, of India, and they began to lose their grip of leadership and political control in some of these places. And when World War II breaks out, it exposes really the weakness of the British Empire in this sense. Secondly, in the country of France, you have political instability. France was very much weakened after World War I. There were a number of issues for this. Obviously, the country had experienced a military attack on its territory by Germany during the First World War. A great number of French men were killed or wounded in the war. A lot of dislocation of families. And France never really fully recovered from that in a sense, as well as having difficulty controlling its colonial empire as well in parts of Africa and Asia. And so France was not exactly a beacon of power and leadership during this time. And then, thirdly, you have the Great Depression. The Great Depression, oftentimes we talk about in an American context, but this is something that actually affected the entire world. And there were great economic difficulties being faced by not only the United States, but countries around the world. And this was a problem pretty much everywhere. Now, in section 2, then, we talk about the rise of the dictatorships. And we want to talk a little bit about what characterized these regimes, these political regimes that took power in Italy, in Germany, certainly in Japan, we see this, in the Soviet Union. Totalitarianism is a big word, it simply is a basic reference to the idea that the government assumes controls over large segments of the life of people living in a society, and they do so by various means. Now, the first one, number one, we had talked about this in our discussion thread, and you made some good observations there. The use of propaganda. Now, I hope that you noted in the Nazi propaganda that you looked at that there were very powerful images used, and oftentimes you didn't even need to look at the writing there. Now, obviously, propaganda does involve the written word as well. The posters, though, relied very heavily on images that were being projected by the art. And this is one of the ways that propaganda is used. Now, in its most basic form, propaganda is information. But obviously, it's information that's intended to communicate a particular kind of message, to project ideas about whether it's a political regime, a nation, what have you. In one sense, advertising is a form of propaganda, if you will. You use this toothpaste, it will make your life happy, or whatever. But in this sense, totalitarianism is characterized oftentimes by manipulating information to project certain ideas that the leaders of the government want. And obviously, Nazi propaganda was used to project the idea that Jews were behind the problems that Germans faced. I think especially poignant is an image of the person that had physical disabilities, and the poster said this guy basically is a drag on society and you're paying for him. Obviously, the devaluing of human life, the projection of strength, power, the positive images of Adolf Hitler, and so forth. The Nazi flag, obviously, very prominent as well. And so, propaganda is something that is used to move people in a particular direction, largely to get the people to, on some level, buy into what the regime, political regime, is all about. Number two, secret police. This is something that you find in totalitarian regimes where, um, unlike a normal police force, secret police spy on people. They try and get information on people who might be considered to be dangerous to the political regime in power, people that don't go along the way they're supposed to. And for example, the Gestapo in Germany was such a group, um, where people had to kind of look over their shoulders, if you will. Secret police forces use informants, where they're offered incentives to rat on their neighbors if they're doing something inappropriate, what have you. And so this is something that is an issue that you find this oftentimes in totalitarian regimes. Number three, I'm sorry if I'm rushing a little bit, but we're not going to try and pull this out too long here. But goals of the state, and I am capitalizing these. I hope that's okay. But capitalizing and bolding these words. Goals of the state are emphasized over individual rights. In fact, individual rights really don't matter in a totalitarian regime, such as you would find here. The interest of the state it overrules the interests of individuals. This is characteristic of socialistic systems. Nazism was a form of socialism, communism as well, even though they were great enemies during the Second World War. The assumption of state power or government power over individual rights is very characteristic of these regimes. Number four, state control over societal institutions. And this is sort of a takeoff from number three there. Political, economic, cultural, education, religion, family, the institutions of society are controlled by the state or the government, and unapologetically. This is how they operate. And so freedom, as we might think of it, is not respected in these regimes. Government by force. This is something that also is consistent with the ideas we've just been talking about. If need be, the government will exercise its will, again, at the expense of the rights of individuals. So the idea that individuals have God-given rights that is not necessarily observed by the state in this kind of system. And then one thing that's very common, one-party political system. There is only one party that is legitimized in these regimes. You don't have choices as you might have in an election in a Republican form of government or a democracy in general terms. The party rules. Communism, section B there. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who led the communist revolution there, are an example of that. We're not going to go into details regarding Lenin at this point. And the communists, they obviously established the government of the Soviet Union beginning in 1917 and then fought a civil war. And the communists were in complete control by about 1922. Section 2 regarding Germany, National Socialism, Nazi, is what National Socialism is. This is what we find in Germany. The Nazis started as a very small group in the early 20s. Adolf Hitler eventually rose to power, and there are two ways you can spell his name. We'll spell it this way, which is more common these days. It seems Adolf Hitler with an F. You can put a PH in there as well. Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. And in retrospect, we look at him and we say, what an evil regime. How is it that it was possible that he could be in power like that? I think there are a number of reasons, and we're going to look at these as follows here. Number one, so-called Weimar Republic was in control of Germany at the end of World War I, and it was a very weak government, and it was very much weakened by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which left Germany largely broke. They were forced to pay for the reparations from World War I. And it was in this mix that you had a number of competing groups that wanted to take power in Germany. Communists, among others, fascists such as Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, those who were more interested in certain constitutional freedoms, and there was this competition for power. Now, so in other words, Hitler could have only become successful in this kind of context. Also, Hitler very much took advantage of German anger over war guilt. In other words, they were forced to apologize, as it were, for the damage caused by World War I. And he took advantage of this angst that the Germans had over the war. And so he was able to manipulate, and again, the use of propaganda. You see all of the bad guys, the devils against the political regime of the Nazis, that the propaganda was really taking advantage of, blaming the problems on others. Thirdly, the Nazi promised to help the economy recover. The country was broke, as we say, largely as a result of the problems in the 1920s. They monetized the debt, printed currency, it became worthless. And so one of the things that Hitler did was, for example, to create a works project program where people would go to work, they would build buildings, bridges, and so forth. Not too dissimilar from what we did here in the United States, interestingly. And sorry about the pop-ups there. We have the promise to restore dignity and pride in people working. And that was one of the things that actually helped Hitler's image, at least initially. We also have strong anti-communism. Now, in order for Hitler to gain power, he had to appeal to the upper classes, who would be potentially his biggest rivals to power if they did not like what he was bringing. But one of the messages that was very common with the Nazi Party was anti-communism. And this appealed to the upper classes because they were very suspicious of communists in their midst. And then the leadership qualities of Hitler, as it says, charisma, inspiring, decisive leader. He was very charismatic. I may share with you later some video of his speeches, which at the time were considered very inspiring by the German people. Of course, there's a propagandizing element to that as well. And you put all of these things together, and Hitler was able to manipulate his way into power by taking advantage of these situations, the context of what was going on in German society at the time. So again, for us looking back, it's hard to understand how someone like Hitler could have gained such influence in German society. But these factors work together. And as we know, this is all under the sovereign hand of God. God was not surprised or thrown a curveball by this. But humanly speaking, these are the things that uh, came together to help bring Hitler to power in Germany. The last thing we'll mention in this section is to talk about Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, the original fascist, if you will. He brought in a program that the Nazis adopted to some extent similarly. But Mussolini came to power in the early 20s. Hitler didn't come to power until the early 30s, a little over a decade later. So, in one sense, Mussolini created a model for what we would call a fascist government, an emphasis on socialism, state controls, limiting of certain private rights. You might think of Mussolini's Italy as maybe being a softer form of that than you would find in Germany. So, for example, Jews in Italian society were asked to leave. They didn't carry out an intense program of persecution such as the Nazis did. Um, but Mussolini eventually was killed by his own people during the Second World War, and Italy eventually changed sides, if you will, during the Second World War, and we'll talk about some of those things later. So that's a quick run through of the chapter Discontent and Experimentation. Make sure you get that down, and make sure I see a copy of this by the 15th, which is next Wednesday, by the end of the day. So with that, we will finish chapter 21. There won't be a quiz, but have a great day.